By the end of this video, you are going to have a very clear understanding of some of the biggest, most important camera settings out there for any camera. I'm talking about ISO. I'm talking about aperture for that creamy, blurry cinematic background, and I'm also talking about shutter speed. Now, shutter speed essentially is, for photography, for an example, is how long the camera is kind of taking the picture. So to give you an example of this here, this is a photograph of my son Cameron jumping off a bench at 1/3200ths of a second. That's a big mouthful. So 1/320. Why can't I say these numbers? Literally everything is frozen in time. However, if we drop this down to something like 1/50, which is that cinematic motion blur, you see motion blur. Simple. And if we drop it down to 1/30, then we see even a little bit more. So that's essentially kind of it. Now I'm going to get to show you guys in a minute how all of this looks when it comes to video, but this is so you get a good understanding of the shutter speed. So the higher the shutter speed, you are freezing time. The lower the shutter speed, you're also freezing time, but you're getting that motion blur in there. And by the way, as well, for those of you who want to know about doing those long kind of star streels and traffic and all of those kind of light trails, that's a very slow shutter speed into the seconds. So that's how all of that is done. Next up is aperture. Now, if you look at my background here, you go, okay, that's kind of blurry. And this is a look that a lot of people want. Now, aperture is measured in f-stop. So depending on the lens you have, like this one here is a Sigma 16 1.4. So basically the aperture will go down to 1.4 and it can go all the way up in this lens to like f16, or in other lenses you can go up to f22 and so on and so forth. Now, let me explain what all of those numbers mean. So f1.4, f1.8 means the lens opens up almost fully. And that leaves a lot of light in. And of course, when things are in focus and the lower the f-stop, like 1.8 or 1.4, you get that creamy, blurry background. Now, if you drive the aperture up higher, like 16 or f22, then the whole shrinks and not a lot of light gets into the lens itself. So what that means, what's wrong with me? What that means basically is, like you can see in this example here of my son Cameron again, more or less everything is in focus because the focal range has changed and the focal depth and the depth of field changes completely depending on the aperture. So depending on what you want to do, if you want that creamy cinematic bokeh look, then you gotta have a lower aperture. And if you want everything in focus, then you gotta have the high aperture. So that's aperture again in a nutshell. By the way, I'm not doing scientific explanations of these at all. There's plenty of Wikipedia articles in this. But my whole goal with this video is for you guys to get a good understanding of what shutter speed is and what aperture is, and also what ISO is. So ISO essentially is a measurement of how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light, and the higher the ISO number, then the more light it takes in. It's kind of like artificial light in a sense, because this can introduce a lot of noise. For example, on a daytime shoot, you're going to have the ISO as low as possible. So like 100 or 125, depending on the mode you're shooting in. You could be limited to 200 if you're going into log profiles. You need a very high ISO as a starting spot. But I'm not going to confuse anybody with that stuff. If you're in a low light situation, like at home in the evening or wherever you are and the light isn't good, you are going to have to shove that ISO up higher, and the higher the ISO number, then the possibility of more noise that the camera is actually going to introduce into the image, which means things don't look very good at all. There is a huge trade-off between shutter speed and aperture and ISO. So the tendency for ISO for a lot of folks starting out is just leave it on auto, and that's okay. Most cameras will have a good enough go at it, but as soon as you can take it out of auto and start dialing it into what's pleasing to you, then the better. But shutter speed is a big, huge difference here. So most people will survive without the blurry background, possibly, but shutter speed can really determine two very, very different looks. And let me show you. First up here is my son Cameron running at that cinematic motion blur of 1/50. And as we can see, if we go through frame by frame here, there is lots of motion blur. Now, what if we increase the shutter speed here to something far higher, like 1/2500? If we go through frame by frame again, we can see there is no motion blur. it's more or less disappeared. And that's a look that a lot of people absolutely hate, because we're kind of conditioned for years looking at movies which are shot over 150, and it just looks a more natural, more pleasing image to everybody when it's kind of that 1/50 or maybe 1/60. Don't get me wrong, there are times where you can absolutely overcrank the shutter for whatever reason. Depending on the mode that you're going to shoot stuff in the camera, if you're an aperture priority, it's going to prioritize the aperture and it'll change the shutter speed accordingly, and the same weight shutter priority. So if you dial in 1/50, it's going to change the aperture to match that. And that's the kind of trade-off that you can't really have a perfect manual setting here without bringing in something like an ND filter, because if you want that 1/50 shutter speed without an ND filter, which is like sunglasses for the camera, that needs to darken everything, you're really not going to get that blurry cinematic bokeh background like with an aperture of f1.8 without an ND filter, because it's all going to be blown out. If you really want to start digging in here and figuring things out, the best thing that I advise you to do is start in one setting, get really familiar with it. So start off in something like aperture priority or shutter priority, where you can dial in the aperture or you can dial in the shutter, and you can see the difference really that the look makes. Now I can show you all of this stuff here like I just have, but until you're shooting your own footage, it's kind of hard to get your head around it. And then once you've got your head around the shutter priority or the aperture priority, then go into manual mode and then see how you can go about mixing the two. And this is where you're going to see lots of problems, where you are possibly going to have to invest in an ND filter depending on the look that you're going for. By now you guys should have a pretty good understanding of aperture, ISO and shutter speed, and something else that's going to help you hugely when it comes to shooting videos is this video here.